Well, good evening, everybody. I'm John Dankosky from the Connecticut Mirror, and tonight is the second of our three legislative session previews. I'll be joined by Connecticut Mirror's economic development reporter, Erica Phillips, housing and children's issues reporter, Ginny, and Justice Reporter Jaden Edison to talk about some potential legislation to look out for this session on their beats and some other things that they're following right now in the news. Tonight's event, as you just saw, is made possible in part through the support of CBIA. You can learn more about CBIA's 2023 Transform Connecticut Policy Solutions at cbia.com. And we want to thank them because this is the third year in a row that they've sponsored this event. It's really appreciated throughout the years that we've been doing these events at the Connecticut Mirror. We've always been able to count on them. So thank you to CBIA. As I mentioned, this is the second in our series of legislative preview events. The first with Mark Pasniokis, the Mirror's Capitol Bureau Chief, is available at ctmirror.org/events. That's a place that you can find all these things archived if you want to go back and look, or you want to direct someone that you know to some of these conversations. You can also find out more about the events that are upcoming at that page. On Wednesday, February 15th at 7 p.m., make your late Valentine's Day plans to join me and Keith Faniff for Keith Faniff's Big Budget Review. It's always a very exciting time to talk about the budget with Keith Faniff. We'll be talking about some of the budget battles expected during this legislative session. You may have some budget questions tonight, which I'm sure that our guests may be able to answer for you. But if they're really about the state budget and some of the things that Keith covers, feel free to save those for the 15th. And Keith will answer them with a series of quirky metaphors. So for tonight, if you want to get involved in this conversation, there's a little Q&A function at the bottom of the screen. Look, I don't have to tell you this. You've done a million Zoom calls in the last 3 years, so you know how this works. But if you want to get involved in the chat that is ongoing with people who are taking part in this conversation, you can obviously do that. There's always good conversation that happens back and forth in the chat. But if you want to ask questions specifically of our panelists today, go to Q&A and ask those questions. And my comrade, Gabby DeBenedictis, who's helping with this, will forward some of those questions to me so that I can get as many answers as possible throughout the course of this next hour. Okay, with all that out of the way, I can introduce once again our panelists, Erica Phillips, Jaden Edison, and Ginny. Thank you all, first of all, for being here. I really appreciate it.
Glad to be here.
Happy to be here.
And Ginny, I'm going to start with you, if that's okay. What I want to do is just get a little bit of a sense from each of you about how you're thinking about this legislative session, who it is you're talking to, what are some of the big issues, just broadly, what are you thinking about as this gets underway and you're thinking about your reporting work over the course of the next couple of months?
Yeah, so I guess, first of all, it's been sort of an issue for many legislative sessions. Zoning is a big question on the housing beat, as it has been in years past. I'm talking to advocates, I'm talking to housing experts, legislators, and also sort of spent the last few months speaking with tenants who were facing eviction, which is another issue that I'm following this legislative session, as well as some other sort of landlord-tenant relationship bills.
Obviously, zoning is something we're going to get to in more depth in just a little bit. Anything having to do with housing is something that comes up in Connecticut a lot. As I think I told you earlier today when we were preparing for this, is probably the conversation I've had most often when I've talked to Connecticut lawmakers and also to Connecticut Mirror reporters over the years. Do you get a sense, Ginny, that more and more people at the state capitol are talking about these issues, that this is really something that they're hearing about from their constituents, and that people say you need to do something about because of the lack of affordable housing, because of the high cost of housing here in Connecticut?
Absolutely. I think there are some outside factors, inflation, that's making the cost of living continue to go up. And when you add to that rents that are rising, and we have the lowest vacancy rate for apartments in the country, I think a lot of legislators this session are really prioritizing housing as an issue because they recognize, they're hearing from their constituents that something has to change. People are having a hard time getting by.
We'll get more into that, and I'm sure we're going to have lots of questions about that in just a little bit. Jaden, how about you? What are the things that you're really watching right now at the beginning of this legislative session?
Absolutely. I'm new here to Connecticut, so I got here in September. So this is my first Connecticut legislative session. So really, a lot of it has been so far just getting to know who's who, talking to a bunch of, advocates and being at the LOB, introducing myself to lawmakers and whatnot. I found, in this kind of expanded, this beat in particular has largely focused in recent years on what's happening inside the Department of Correction, and prisons, jails, et cetera, et cetera. And so I've tried to really take a little bit of a broader definition of justice. And so, particularly like today, for example, I was at the LOB and, there was a press conference held to announce, I guess, the state level Voting Rights Act, right? That would essentially take a lot of the protections that have been gutted at the federal level via the 1965 Voting Rights Act that has been, amended and amended time after time, that have been gutted by the Supreme Court, and issue some of those protections locally, right? And I think also when you go back to what's actually happening inside prisons and jails, there's a lot, I think, that people are sort of looking for. I know in particular, I'm sure folks on this call, Stop Solitary CT has been huge on trying to limit strip searches inside the Department of Correction, right? I know they, were the proponents behind the Protect Act last year, which was a massive bill that essentially, created some form of oversight over the DOC, but in addition to that, kind of limited the conditions in which people could spend in isolated confinement. So that's another one that I think will be very interesting to see how that plays out, among public hearings and among, advocates in relation to that, when you note the success that, the advocates have had in that realm. I think also another big thing too, which for me is new to me, a new area that I'm kind of have taken a crash course on, is bail, right? I mean, bail is something that's a hot button issue for a lot of people. And so, I mean, there have already been, I've counted a handful of bills, right, that have already been filed in relation to bail. I think at least one that has already been voted on to be drafted, right, to reform the bail system, right, to kind of maybe, essentially look like places like New Jersey, right, that have sort of, made, strides in that area. So those are some of the big ones that I'm looking at. But I think, there's a lot out there. I mean, one thing I forgot, clean slate, right? When you talk about the legalization of cannabis use, right? That's one part of it, right? There have already been expungements started for some 44,000 people by Governor Ned Lamont's administration, but there are still hundreds of thousands of people as a part of the bigger clean slate effort who've been delayed, essentially, right, of having their records expunged. And so there's just so much legislation, the potential for so much to happen. But those are some of the key ones that I've been looking at and learning about.
Well, and we'll get into detail on some of those, but I actually want to get back to something you said, which I think is a really interesting reframing here for the Mirror in your beat, is taking that broader look at justice and the fact that you did cover the Voting Rights Act today. How do you see justice coverage? Because I mean, a lot of people on this beat broadly, it used to be called criminal justice. And right, when you put the word criminal in front of it, it says something very specific. You're covering cops, you're covering courts, you're covering jails. And there's also I guess, a bias toward the idea that this is criminal behavior somehow. We used to call it justice. That opens it up to a whole bigger issue, doesn't it?
Absolutely. And I think you have to look at a couple of things, right? I think when you look at the Mirror's role, and being able to provide the kind of behind the curtain stories, right? And I think, some of these areas are let's just call it what it is. I mean, a lot of these are areas that are vastly undercover, right? When we're talking about voting access, right? We can talk about bail. I had a conversation with some folks in the legislative office building last week in Hartford who were just telling me about all the stories in bail that have sort of gone unreported and whatnot, just by virtue of our news landscape, right? Like not having the resources that we once had. And so I think the Mirror plays a unique role in being able to fill some of that void. And also think the Mirror also has given, each of us reporters a lot of real estate to kind of pursue where our interest lies. And so for me and my background, right, I've always been interested in how race sort of informs and how divided our country and our states and cities are along the lines of race, and how that's at the foundation of virtually, everything that we, talk about on a day-to-day basis. And so for me, those are huge things. I'm very interested and in tune with what's going on in other places when it comes to voting access, when it comes to environmental justice, which is a place that I love to report on at some point as I get more acclimated to this beat. And just so many other things. Obviously, Ginny, can tell you all about housing justice. There are so many different things and different avenues. And so Yeah, it is a challenge, right? Because, especially getting started, you want to be able to zero in and kind of build a knowledge base. But, for me, though, I think long term is just continue to kind of plant seeds in different places and see, and essentially revisit them at some point down the line and do more in-depth stories.
Well, and I actually want to turn to Erica here. And Erica, before I ask you about some of the things that are really at the top of your beat right now and things you're looking at this legislative session, I think much like Jaden just talked about in terms of covering justice, economic development, I don't know, it used to be a business beat. You know what I mean? Like economic development could be seen as what are the manufacturers, what are the big employers in the state trying to do? How are people investing in the economy of Connecticut? But I know that you view it as a much broader thing. How do you view covering economic development here in Connecticut?
Yeah, I mean, I see almost every story as an economic story, and maybe there's something wrong with me, but it's if you think about every human being, that human being has a lot of potential. And when leaders say they want to grow the economy, they know that they need people. Connecticut has this conversation over and over again that the population is flat. Well, there's a lot of people here who are not in the workforce, who can't really fully be in the workforce for whatever reason, can't get to a job at certain places. So there's a lot of untapped potential here. So I think about that. I think about those things a lot, and I think that the state leaders are thinking about that as well. So Lamont has stated that his number one goal is to grow the economy. That means he says this a lot too. He says, I don't want to raise taxes. I want to grow the number of taxpayers, right? So we want to get more people in jobs. And there's a lot of work that goes into that. There's a lot of initiatives at the legislative level that are happening for that. So workforce is a huge theme on my beat, as well as there's a lot of industry. So we're talking about business. Of course, business plays a part in this. Industries are adjusting to a lot of things right now. In some cases, really extreme change, new technology. And then I sort of always have this vision in my mind of every economic chart over the last 3 years has a huge hiccup in it, right?
Mm-hmm.
A huge jump down, back up. And in a lot of cases, Connecticut, a lot of those measurements hasn't caught all the way back up. And so what are we doing to kind of bring that forward momentum back? And that's what legislators are thinking about. So in really broad strokes, that's what we're at.
Yeah. And I think, obviously a lot of your work takes place talking with people outside the Capitol, although you're doing an awful lot of work talking with people in the Capitol too. As you think about how you're covering this legislative session and the big stories that you have, what is on your plate? Because your beat is a little different than Ginny's and Jaden's in that way.
Yeah. Just to kind of drill down into the workforce questions, what's interesting is just how much overlap there is with higher ed. So you're thinking about, I cover both the Commerce Committee and the Higher Education and Workforce Development Committee, and people in the business world and people in higher ed are, I haven't been here for that long, but from what I hear from the folks I'm talking to, in some cases for the first time, having really deep conversations about how do we make sure that we're developing the workforce that is needed in the state, or retraining people. There's huge populations of people who have worked in the past or are wanting to switch careers, or whatever they were doing is no longer really a viable sector anymore, and they need to switch. That retraining these are all conversations that at least since I've been here are really happening among legislators. Lamont has started a Office of Workforce Strategy that's sort of forcing these people into rooms together from the higher ed world and from the business world. And so there, when it comes to kind of some of the big topics that I'm going to be covering, there is going to be a lot of this work on labor force retention, labor force training, and things like, tying student loan relief to a job. So if you work for a Connecticut company, there are incentives to help you pay off your loans. If you there's a program called Learn Here, Live Here that helps you with home ownership. If you went to school here, you're gonna get some assistance from the state in terms of trying to kind of put down roots here. Funding scholarships for students, free community college so that students who are from Connecticut will stay in Connecticut for school. So it's all these kind of like components of really trying to retain the population that is here and train folks for the jobs that need to be filled. And there's a lot of thinking about that going on.
Well, I think that's a good transition to get back into some of the stuff that Ginny's covering so closely here. Ginny, when we come to any issues of workforce, there's always a question of where will the people who work in Connecticut actually live? And it's not just Connecticut, obviously, that has a housing crisis. It's not just that Connecticut has a problem with affordable housing, but because of the nature of the state, it is more acute. And some places like Fairfield County, where it's very, very expensive to live, it's hard to retain workers. What right now is happening at the state capitol where people are actually saying, we've got to do something about this and we got to make more housing more affordable to more people across the state?
Right. So I think this is a good spot to talk about zoning reform. And one point I did want to make it is when we're talking about retaining the population, if you think of a family, 2 parents, 2 children, when those 2 children grow up, they need somewhere to live. And often the people who are struggling to find places to live are people like the bus drivers or restaurant workers or grocery store workers. So all of these people need places to live, and ideally you get to live and work in the same spot, which is very difficult for many Connecticut families. And on the topic of zoning reform, that often comes about because many municipalities in the state restrict the amount of multifamily housing that can be built. When I say multifamily housing, I mean apartments, which tend to be more affordable to large chunks of the population that have, struggled to build up the equity required to put a down payment on a home. Lots of other reasons. There's a couple of notable pieces of zoning reform, one being the work, live, ride proposal from Desegregate CT. And that sort of provides a few incentives to towns to build more residential density around transit stations. So train stations, bus stops, kind of to encourage walkable communities around these neighborhoods. And there's, environmental benefits to this proposal. Many people with lower incomes need to use public transportation to get to work because they don't have cars. So these are sort of the things they're talking about. The other one is fair share, which would assess the need for affordable housing across Connecticut by region and then sort of divide that need up between municipalities. So it would say to each one, hey, you need to plan and zone for X number of affordable units, and then they would be responsible for doing that.
Yeah.
So those are a couple of the things we've seen.
It feels like the first of those 2 proposals, the transit-oriented development, is oriented, and we've heard a lot of this. Some of this has been done in Connecticut and it's been talked about for quite some time. It feels like that's a little bit more of a carrot, and the second is a little bit more of a stick. Am I judging that right?
So that's I guess one way to put it. I, not having seen the proposal for this year, I don't know that there would be what sort of consequences there would be for towns that don't plan and zone for their portion. But I think people who are in favor of that law would sort of emphasize that towns would not be responsible for actually developing that housing, right? Because towns are not housing developers, but they would be responsible for saying like, okay, we're going to let you build apartments in this part of town.
Mm-hmm. Erica, had you want to jump in?
Let's see. Yeah, just a little kind of piggyback on what Ginny's talking about. So housing development, which is necessary. There's a conversation sort of on this business side of some lawmakers and state leaders talking to companies themselves about building their own housing for the workforce that they need. So and offering potentially some state incentives to help with developments like that. So that's a caveat to what Ginny was talking about, but there is this, it's very much an awareness on the business side that these are really crucial developments.
But can business leaders, our business leaders in Connecticut, our individual corporations or business organizations pushing to make some of these changes at the town level, because that's really where the changes need to happen, right? The state can do whatever it wants and try to, force people to develop in certain ways, but that there's always resistance to being met. If businesses are saying, we want to build a bigger facility in town X, but we ain't going to be able to do it if you don't give us some places to put our workers. And is that something that's being talked about in the economic development community?
In careful ways. There's a lot of maybe competing interests on that topic. So yeah, the conversations tend to be the word choices are very careful, but yeah.
Go ahead, Ginny. Yeah.
I will say sort of to add to that, the press conference to sort of open up Work, Live, Ride, the transit-oriented communities proposal was held at a business that's very close to a train station. So I think that's sort of the other piece to that particular proposal, is not just that this business and others in the area are looking for places for their workers to live, but they're hoping more people move in there and can say like, hey, I'm just going to walk half a block down to the gastro park and get some food. So that's the other sort of thing, is they want people to live and have fun in the same community.
I do have a question coming in from Margaret here. And again, if you have questions for our panelists, you can put them in the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen. Margaret asks, are there any concerns about environmental exposure when people propose putting new housing near transportation centers? I'm sure there's a lot of potential issues in there, Ginny. I mean, one of them is you put a cluster of people and cars or trains or buses all together, and you have more congestion, certainly more emissions. I don't know if that's something that has been addressed by people who are making these proposals.
So I don't know that has been brought up so much so far in the conversation. But use of public transit, although there certainly are studies that show being near certain bus routes, highways can be bad for your respiratory health, that use of public transit generally is a benefit to the environment because it reduces the use of cars.
I want to come back to some of these issues in just a little bit. I want to turn to Jaden for a second here, because as we talk about where people live, where they can afford to live, I want to loop back to the story that you covered today about voting rights in Connecticut. What exactly is being proposed in terms of a state voting rights act? We want to make sure that some of the protections for people to be able to go to the polls and exercise their voting rights are upheld. What's being discussed right now?
Yeah, so a lot of it too, I think to note that there's been momentum for this in recent years, with New York most recently passing, exhaustive legislation, its own state level voting rights act. And so Connecticut largely resembles that one. I think, there are three or four major bullet points that I look at when it comes to the local voting rights act. I think one of the big things, right, is being able to now mandate language assistance resources when it comes to people who speak languages other than English, right? I think that's according to the census, right, that's what, a little less than a quarter of people who live in Connecticut. And so a considerable number of people when it comes to, getting registration forms, or whatever it may be, right, being able to provide the adequate assistance to those people. I think another part of it too is to be able to deter people from acts of intimidation and deception and all those things by allowing people to pursue perhaps civil legal action, right, when it comes to having their rights infringed upon when it comes to voting. So I think that's another major component of it. And then I think third too is I think the major part of the federal legislation that has been gutted by the Supreme Court was the pre-clearance notion, right? And that was essentially, implemented to be able to stop, I guess, places, cities, or if we're talking about federally, right, like states that have large, long histories of voter discrimination, right? And so what that method essentially says is that, pre-clearance, essentially, if you have a history of said discriminatory practices, that essentially means that any changes to local election policy has to be approved by the federal government. And so the same notion would take place here in Connecticut if that bill were to be passed in its current kind of language and form, in that any kind of localities that have histories of discrimination, which I think would be interesting to see what kind of formulas they come up with to determine that. But any, localities with histories of discrimination would essentially have to, seek approval from the state when it comes to changing any local election related policy. So just a super exhaustive legislation, but I think,
Yeah.
When you think about what we've seen, nationally, right, like in a bunch of these areas were things that we once thought was settled law, right, when it comes to, abortion access, right, when it comes, all these things, right, when it comes to voting rights, the Voting Rights Act was monumental, right? I think most scholars and historians hold that we didn't have an actual democracy until the Voting Rights Act was passed in 1965, after Bloody Sunday. And so, you think about what that means and what we've seen recently from the Supreme Court majority. I've heard, Secretary of State Stephanie Thomas say today, better to be safe than sorry, right, when it comes to implementing these practices and whatnot. And so those are some of the big takeaways that I've gleaned from that bill. And I'd be interested to see, because it hasn't, it's been around for a couple of years, and lawmakers have been trying to push this. So I'd be interested to see kind of what momentum this might have, after, the majority of voters overwhelmingly supported in-person early voting on the ballot this past year.
Well, yeah, that's the big one. I mean, if Connecticut has been traditionally one of the most restrictive states when it comes to voting by absentee ballot. We make it very, very difficult. It's very easy for a state like Connecticut to look down its nose at states in the South that have long lines, people lined up to vote, and all sorts of restrictive voting policies, but we don't make it very easy for people to vote by absentee. We've got some questions coming in on other parts of your beat, Jaden. Kathleen asks, will we see anything with youth justice this session? It was minimal last session with the election, and there was, of course, this focus on a, quote, rise in juvenile crime. Last session, before you were here in Connecticut, an awful lot of anything that happened around youth justice all had to do with there's carjackings and there's a wave of youth violence and crime. What's being talked about this time?
Yeah, that's one thing that's interesting. And we talk about expanding the justice beat. I think that's a part of it too, and getting involved in that. And I think so far I've seen close to around a dozen or so bills filed with the Judiciary Committee when it comes to justice related things. So, some of those have ranged from things like raising the age to in which, young people can be, arrested. Right. So that's one thing we've seen. And we've also seen a bill, that would essentially, that has to do with a juvenile policy review board. So some kind of oversight entity of how we're handling some of those things. So nonetheless, I think that's, if there wasn't much traction last year, just based on what we've seen so far this year, 12 or so, a dozen or so bills so far filed, I definitely think that'll be something that, we hear a lot about in the coming weeks as the legislature gets, the Judiciary Committee, and in particular, gets settled on some of the bills that it's going to draft and bring forth for public hearings. I'm sure there'll be a lot of contested, conversations about that I'll definitely be in tune with and trying to follow.
So, Erica, one thing that I think, as we broadly define the justice beat, one of the things that I think a lot of people in Connecticut for years have talked about around justice is issues of healthcare costs, the ability for people to actually make their ends meet, be able to get affordable childcare. These are all real economic development issues. And I know that a lot of employers in Connecticut are talking about this. What are some of the things you're watching this legislative session and covering when it comes to the high cost of healthcare and how we might think about addressing this once again? Because this is something that comes up every single legislative session, and almost all the time it doesn't get changed all that much.
Yeah, so thematically, it's sort of this concept of enabling the workforce. So, like helping out with things like transportation, childcare, housing we talked about, healthcare costs and so forth, so that people can go to work, because a lot of people just can't. So one of the topics I have looked pretty deeply at is childcare, and this is a particularly interesting on the economic development beat, because child care providers are businesses themselves, right? And so there is kind of an opportunity, the legislature has seen an opportunity to help those businesses function, which is economic development that not only helps the people running those businesses, but helps the people whose children are attending childcare at those businesses, and those people are enabled to enter the workforce. So there's sort of this, if you think about it, kind of this double, double of impact of economic development efforts and dollars going toward these types of businesses. There is assistance for small childcare providers, but the numbers I've seen on advocates for this sector of what they actually need to shore up this industry and to function is in the hundreds of millions of dollars. And it's so much money that it can be a little bit, you almost can't get your head around it. But if you think about sort of conceptually, if there was childcare available in Connecticut to everyone, that's a huge workforce benefit. I mean, so kind of they're making that argument. There's a lot of tying it together with the economic benefit. Again, just not like, I don't think this is necessarily difficult to get your head around, but I've sat around thinking like, goodness, if you decide to have a kid from 0 to 5, you got to figure out what you're going to do for work, and that's just how it is. Now imagine there's a state, one of the 50 states, where you wouldn't have to think about that. Right? So it's a very strong economic argument, workforce argument for not just childcare, but providing the types of assistance that can enable people to work.
But I just want to say, I think that makes such a good case, and it's obviously why people both at the state level, at the state capitol, and also in the business community are thinking about that. But of all the industries that were really impacted around COVID, I'd say childcare probably as much as anything else. It was already a stretched thin workforce. People were working long hours at a difficult job, not being paid all that much money. A lot of them were due payouts from federal relief that they thought was going to be bigger than the $1,000 check that they were getting. And then, the state came through with a much smaller check. The ability to retain that workforce and train that workforce is a pretty difficult one. Even if you found the money, Erica, to be able to do that, that's a big question, because that workforce has kind of been decimated over the course of the last couple of years.
Very true. So there are some initiatives to try to address that as well. One is making it so any childcare worker, if they have kids that need childcare, that childcare would be free. Right now, it's not. They have to apply for reimbursements and such. So there's like that type of initiative. There is incentives for people. These are all proposals, obviously, but for people who go through childcare training, some incentives, I think, on student loans that have been proposed, and I may be incorrect, but basically that thinking is absolutely correct. The number of slots in childcare in Connecticut has, there's a huge disparity of not available childcare slots. So, and that is because teachers couldn't do it anymore. There's a job at Amazon paying $22 an hour, which I need no training for, and it's less stressful, and I might not, so on and so on. But there's sort of, as with any economic policy, there's trying to figure out the right incentives to shore up different types of sectors, and they're thinking about all those possibilities.
I want to turn to you, Ginny, and talk about some of the other things that you've been covering. And as we talk about already where people live, where they can afford to live. The places that they live, there've been a lot of movements over the course of the last couple of years at the state legislature to look at tenants' rights, to look at evictions in the state. These are issues that affect children probably about as much as anybody. What are we doing right now at the state level as we are in this legislative session to look at tenants' rights, to look at how we handle evictions of people, especially at a tough economic time?
Yeah, so I think, first of all, you hit on something really important, which is that these issues affect children and often affect children disproportionately. We know that families with children are more likely to face eviction than families without children. So there's a few sort of legislative measures floating around this session. Some eviction reform bills, one of which would expand protections against no-cause evictions, which are typically evictions that occur when leases expire, to include more tenants in larger apartment buildings. There's a fairly large sort of grassroots movement to cap rent increases at 2.5% each year, and that includes between tenants. And then a couple of other things, a bill that would cap the amount landlords can charge for application fees for apartments, lots of things that are looking to make things a little easier for tenants.
When it comes to issues like capping rent, landlord fees, that sort of thing, where are lawmakers looking at putting the onus? Is this essentially telling landlords what you can and can't charge year over year? Is this giving the tenants themselves more rights to be able to contest whenever this actually happens? What's the mechanism by which this would work?
Yeah, so we're still in a part of the session when a lot of the details of these bills are not hammered out yet, and neither of them have had a public hearing just yet. So some of those I can't answer at this moment, but I do think you're sort of hitting at a core point of discussion in this, which is what is the role of government in sort of implementing consumer protections within the landlord-tenant relationship, was just super complicated field. Yeah, so it's been some interesting discussions in the housing committee so far.
Yeah, and putting the onus on landlords versus putting the onus on tenants themselves, because this has been, I think, over the course of the pandemic, this has been some of the questions that people have had. Should it be up to tenants to have to challenge evictions, to have to challenge unfair, as they see it, rent increases, or should there's be some sort of mechanism to actually go after landlords for this directly from the state level or from the town or municipal level? That's a big difference, because tenants don't have a whole lot of power to begin with, and they also don't have a lot of time. They're like, I don't know, working and taking care of their kids and stuff.
Right. Yeah. And, as far as protections against rent increases, there are Connecticut towns that have fair rent commissions that have some power to sort of help folks sort that out. However, they're not in every town in Connecticut. So again, it's about where you live, whether you have an active fair rent commission in your town. And even when tenants do go to the bodies that are in place to complain about problems, whether it be rent, whether it be housing conditions, they are risking an awful lot. So I think these bills are looking to address these in a way that feels more equitable.
Jaden, we got a question coming in from Barbara, who says, bail is so important, especially in Connecticut, when the prison population is nearly 50% people who can't afford bail, never convicted of anything. The time spent waiting for justice cannot be recovered. Do you have any insight, she asks, into whether Connecticut plans to remedy that fact?
I do. I really think that, and this is pure just based off some conversations that I've had at the LOB, but it does seem like bail is going to be something that's definitely at least going to be discussed exhaustively, within the Judiciary Committee. I know in particular, there's been some conversation and some of the reporting I've done over the past several months and talking to folks about bail in particular, is a lot of people, feel that, there are states elsewhere who handle bail a lot way more, I guess, efficiently, than Connecticut does. I know particularly there's a bill, I can't remember which bill this was. This is a bill filed this legislative session, essentially, that would, essentially establish a bail system that would essentially be based on risk assessment and danger to a community, right? And so it gives you the opportunity to be able to deny someone bail, if they are, someone who's determined to be a risk or, flight risk or a danger or whatever it might be, and then opening the door for people who perhaps have lower level offenses and things of that nature to not even have to deal with it. So I know that is something that has been filed. And I imagine that, with what we've seen in places like New Jersey and, Illinois has made, vast changes to, eliminating cash bail. I do think that, with Connecticut's kind of reputation of kind of, being, I guess, at the forefront of some of these conversations, at least, that it'll definitely be something that becomes a important conversation within the judiciary in particular.
You mentioned earlier a clean slate legislation. Obviously, the Lamont administration has expunged the criminal records of over 40,000 people with low-level cannabis convictions. This is all part of the legalization of cannabis in the state. But a lot of the bigger efforts at clean slate have kind of been stalled. Where do we stand right now, Jaden?
So, this has been an entire, I think a lot of the people on the call would probably hear you talking about it and are just like shaking their heads. This has been quite the story, right? I mean, you had, the essential, this larger clean slate effort, right? Which this entails multiple bills, right? You have the cannabis related expungements, which is a part of the legalization of the cannabis use. That's one bill. And then you have the actual, which most people refer to as the clean slate bill, which is the one that would essentially erase a lot of the lower level felony convictions and misdemeanors and whatnot. And so, that legislation was passed in 2021. And so, and the idea with that, from my understanding, is that you would have an entire year to work out the X's and O's and in terms of, what systems we need to upgrade, what technology we need, who needs to do what, et cetera, et cetera. But it wasn't until just, within the last couple months, really just weeks before the new year, when Governor Lamont's administration even, gave word or gave a hint that there will be a delay with that. And so, the Lamont administration has alluded to, outdated technology systems and outstanding legal and policy questions that sort of need to be answered, in relation to those lower level, felony convictions and whatnot. But, there's studies, right, that essentially, and this is a number that lawmakers have been throwing around. I mean, hundreds of thousands of people who would benefit from the part of the legislation, clean slate legislation, that hasn't been, implemented yet. And I think what's notable about that is that you had Governor Lamont around the time when this bill was being negotiated. Governor Lamont was kind of on the side of, let's tiptoe around this first. Let's get us a tapered list of crimes first that we do, and then let's see how it works. Let's do it incrementally, right? And so it is, I hate to, I think people look at this and are just frustrated with the kind of what seemingly to advocates, at least, and people on the ground who would benefit from clean slate. There is a seemingly tiptoe, and maybe not, they don't feel as if, officials and lawmakers have, or value some of the issues that they champion very much. And so in the legislature, I think there's real potential now to see some kind of potential clarifying legislation around some of those outstanding questions or the technology. That's something certainly that Senator Gary Winfield has alluded to and said he'd be ready and he's on board 100% to address any of those issues if they come up. So I haven't seen, I don't know if it's because I missed, maybe I missed, but I don't think I've missed. I haven't seen any clean slate legislation filed just yet. But I do think that, people are really, wanting, this thing to be passed. It was promised, it was touted as this landmark piece of legislation that would do a lot for a lot of people. And I think a lot of people are just disappointed with the lack of transparency on where that stands.
Well, and this is something that always comes up, Erica, too, in the state. I mean, there's a lot of different levels at which this makes sense. I mean, one is very clear. If we're going to legalize marijuana, we need to expunge the records of people who were charged with these low-level offenses. And what that means is we have fewer people in prison and jail. That means we have lower costs to incarcerate those people for things from a long time ago that maybe weren't all that big a deal. But it's an economic development opportunity for the state as well. I mean, look, all of a sudden you have thousands of more workers who are able to get jobs, who don't have on their criminal record something that is haunting them from 10 years ago. When you talk to people on the economic development beat, are you hearing from people that legislation like this and actually following through with clean slate legislation gives us the opportunity to have more people, you know, able to do jobs?
Sure. Yeah, and let's see, folks who, and I don't know that this is the same population, but the reentry population, the formerly incarcerated population, you know, there's lots of opportunities, and there's programs trying to provide workforce development, short-term training for folks who are in that transitional period. You know, cool programs I've heard about, you know, getting a commercial driver's license, or doing short-term training in various industries at the community colleges, which are available to folks. But sort of on the cannabis side, there's lots of interesting ways to look at what is happening here. So this is a new industry, right? Adult use marijuana. A new highly regulated industry that's where the rules of the industry are trying to solve, you know, systemic wrongs going back generations. And there's a lot of really complicated kind of like you know, where these businesses can be, you know, where the businesses should locate so that they provide the greatest benefit to folks. But I've found it, and this is just sort of an aside, but I found it a really interesting thing to follow in terms of just how does a state stand up an industry that is highly regulated and has every intention, well, is trying to put out that it has every intention to make it very fair and use the industry to fix systemic problems. Where can it go wrong? The answer is everywhere. You know, everything can go wrong. And so there's a lot of kind of messiness as this industry is getting up and running. There's a lot of perceived injustice and just complicated ins and outs. And so, you know, if you want drama, follow the cannabis industry. I'm doing my best, but everything that this legalization is trying to do is so ambitious, and you know, everyone wants the best outcome, but it's already just complicated on both sides.
Well, look, for the people that you talk to who say that the only way that business can thrive is with little oversight and regulation from the state, right? For those people, I mean, the birth of the cannabis industry in Connecticut is like the absolute opposite of that. It is a non-entrepreneurial, completely state-run enterprise that is trying to, as you say, be fair to all parties, but is never going to get there. Other states have had a real hard time implementing some of the fairness policies that they've tried to in terms of getting diversity into the workforce. That's a huge thing, and that's going to be fascinating for you to follow.
You know, John, too, I wanted to add this. I mean, this is kind of super relevant to this conversation. Is I want to be really clear too about who Clean Slate would help. Right, when you talk about, you know, Black and brown people predominantly, particularly in Connecticut, right? Yep. I mean, Black people in Connecticut who make up just a small percentage, 12 to somewhere between 12 to 14% of our state population, right? They make up the vast majority of felony convictions, you know, in the state of Connecticut. So when we're talking about how the war on drugs has disproportionately affected communities of color, and you talk about specifically how having a criminal record can prohibit you from attaining housing and attaining educational opportunities, right? And economic opportunities, right? All these various things that kind of intersect with people's beats here. It's vastly important. And so, you know, the governor's, you know, administration in the track record when it comes to, you know, addressing the issues that matter most to the most vulnerable communities, right? Low income communities, communities consisting of mostly of people of color. It doesn't look good. It doesn't bode well, right? To have this major legislation that was promised that would provide so many you know, additional economic opportunities for folks to kind of, you know, get off the ground and get moving. The optics don't look too well, and I think people are really feeling that too. Who you know are who would directly benefit from Clean Slate.
We've got a few minutes left in our conversation. We've got some more questions coming in. Bryce asks the question, Ginny here, affordable housing wasn't a hot topic in many communities until developers took advantage of 830G and were able to work around some zoning rules. Now efforts and interest is centered around how to revise, repeal 830G rather than actually increase affordable housing. Can these two efforts truly work together? Is anyone hopeful about that?
So there's like a lot of layers to that.
There's a lot of layers to that question. And maybe we can
Yeah.
start by just, there's a lot of people on our call here who are very deeply steeped in Connecticut policy, but for those who don't understand when someone's talking about 830G and in zoning, could you just explain a little bit about what that means?
Sure. So 8-30G is a tool that Connecticut has had for several decades to increase the deed restricted affordable housing in the state. And when I say deed restricted, I mean particular types of housing that the government has said, we will subsidize this. So housing choice vouchers is a good example. Public housing is another example. And this law says that there are court remedies for developers who propose affordable housing in towns that have less than 10% of their housing stock designated affordable. That's deed restricted affordable. And it is such an important distinction when we're talking about this issue. 8-30G has been fairly controversial. I think it's important when we're talking about 8-30G to note that there are a lot of myths and misconceptions out there about the law. For example, there's no statewide requirement that you have 10% of your housing stock be affordable. That's a misread of the law that's very common. So that is what 8-30G is, and it has come under fire several times. We saw it during the Dankosky campaign, and recently the House Republicans have introduced a bill that would have pretty wide-ranging effects on the law. So I guess to your question of whether reforms to that law can work hand in hand with zoning efforts, I don't want to say that no, that's impossible, but many of these efforts around 8-30G would weaken the law, which is sort of the opposite of what zoning reform is trying to do, which is to increase more affordable housing. I also would sort of say, you know, I think affordable housing has gotten a lot more discussion in recent years, but to say that it wasn't a hot topic years ago, I think is just not true for many communities.
Yeah, it's depending on who you are and where you live, it's been a very hot topic for a very, very long time.
Exactly. Yeah. This crisis did not pop up out of nowhere.
But before we run out of time, I know, Erica, one last thing that I know you're looking at very closely is high-tech manufacturing, how we can get support for more businesses that are trying to transition to new technologies. And of course, as we've been talking about all throughout this, get the workforce trained up. Well, what are we looking at in this legislative session? What sort of stories are you following when it comes to manufacturing right now?
Yeah, just Connecticut is kind of holds itself in high regard in terms of being a center of advanced manufacturing. But there's a lot of things changing in manufacturing these days, a lot of high tech coming into it, robotics, digitization, and a lot of other words that you might have to look up, but AI and so forth. And so, you know, how do you bring an entire sector that has been a large portion of the state's GDP into a new era? And the legislators have been working on this. There's a lot of efforts that got started within the last couple of years to provide education to small and medium-sized manufacturing businesses who don't necessarily have access to these expensive technologies, but can go learn about them, learn how to use them, decide whether they want to buy them. So there's the piece of like educating the companies themselves. And then there's the piece of developing education programs for people who will work at those companies. It's sort of an interesting, just little piece of stuff that's going on at the Capitol this session. How does the state support the transitioning of one of its, marquee industries into a new era? So it's kind of an interesting thing to keep an eye on.
Erica Phillips is the economic development reporter for the Connecticut Mirror. Ginny Monk is the housing and children's issues reporter. Jaden Edison covers justice for the Connecticut Mirror. I want to thank you all, not just for spending some time with me tonight and talking about your beats, but for your expertise and all the great reporting that you're doing. We really appreciate it. And thank you so much for your time.
Thank you
for having us.
Thanks for coming, everyone.
Yeah.
Yeah. And boy, we got a lot of good questions. If your question didn't get answered, we just got a lot coming in, and we're going to have more time for more questions when we talk to Keith Faniff for his big budget review. It's Wednesday, February 15th at 7 p.m. Again, if you don't do anything with your loved one for Valentine's Day, just say, we're going to watch Keith and John talk about the budget. They'll love that. Again, that's happening at 7 o'clock, February 15th. It's a Wednesday. And again, it's a live Zoom event. If you missed the conversation that I had with Mark Pasniokis, the Capitol Bureau Chief, about some of the politics at play in this legislative session, you can go to ctmirror.org/events. It's also a place where you can find out more about this. Our events tonight made possible in part through the support of CBIA. You can learn more about CBIA's 2023 Transform Connecticut Policy Solutions at cbia.com. We thank them for their support. We also thank Gabby DeBenedictis, who ran all the technology behind the scenes here at the headquarters at the Connecticut Mirror in the Asylum Hill district of Hartford. So thank you so much, Gabby. One last thing for you. I know that you go to the Mirror all the time for your news and information. These reporters that you heard from tonight, Mark Pasniokis and Keith Faniff and all the others at the Connecticut Mirror, they do this work because of support from people who read the Mirror. People like you. If you haven't yet for this year made that donation to the Connecticut Mirror, there's a big red donate button on the upper right corner. And I've been saying this in public radio for years, and it's like the God's honest truth. It doesn't matter if you give $5 or $20 or $10,000. It literally supports nonprofit, nonpartisan journalism of the type that the Mirror does. It's not everywhere in America, folks. Not every place has a Connecticut Mirror, but we have it because of people like you who've given in the past. So consider a gift right now. Hit that big donate button. Make a contribution today to support nonprofit, nonpartisan journalism in your backyard that covers this great state that we all love so much. All right, folks, well, have a really good night. See you in a couple of weeks with Keith Faniff, and please enjoy, drive home safe, or just have a good evening.